"Please, I'm cold." The human pulled her down. Now she won't let him go. The wind howled across the icy expanse of the planet. Ice and snow danced in the air, swirling around in a chaotic frenzy as the cold penetrated everything. It was a place where few dared to venture, a frozen world that offered no warmth, no shelter, no mercy. For most, this was a place of death. But for one lone human, it was just another assignment. He had been here before, surviving on his own, seeking answers and fighting to stay alive. The man's breath puffed in white clouds as he trudged through the snow, the crunch of his boots the only sound in the silent, frozen landscape. His mission had been simple: survey the planet and make sure no one was here. But as his eyes scanned the horizon, something caught his attention, movement, faint but distinct in the distance. He paused, squinting through the thick flurry of snow, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There was something, or rather, someone moving in the distance, struggling against the storm. The human's instincts kicked in, and he turned his body toward the shape, already calculating the distance, the wind's speed, the risk. It didn't take long for him to realize that the figure was not one of the usual scavengers or wildlife he might expect on such a barren planet. This was something or someone different. A person, a woman. She was alone, barely visible but clearly in distress. Her movements were sluggish, as though she were fighting the cold, her body trembling in a way that spoke of deep exhaustion. He knew that he couldn't leave her out there. No one could survive this kind of cold for long. The human broke into a run, his breath quickening, the cold air biting his face as he closed the distance. Every step felt like a battle against the storm, but he pushed on, determined to reach her. He had seen death on this planet before, but this was something else, something that felt personal. When he finally reached her, she was barely standing. Her clothes, strange and unlike anything he had ever seen before, were soaked through, clinging to her body in the freezing wind. Her skin was pale, lips a dark blue, and her eyes barely open, as if she were about to lose consciousness. Without thinking, the human reached for her, pulling her toward him. Her body was light, fragile, her weight hardly enough to slow him down as he lifted her into his arms. She was a stranger, someone from another world, but in that moment it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was getting her to safety. With his arms around her, he began making his way back to the shelter, taking quick, determined steps. He knew it would be a fight to get them both to the warmth of the shelter. But the thought of letting her stay out here to die was not an option. He could feel her shivering in his arms, her body trembling uncontrollably. She wasn't just cold, she was freezing, her life hanging by a thread. As he reached the shelter, the wind howling behind him, he felt a strange sense of urgency. His fingers fumbled with the door controls, his hands numb from the cold, but he finally managed to slide them open. He stepped inside, carrying her with careful urgency. The warmth of the shelter hit them both like a wave, but it wasn't enough to instantly bring her back to life. She needed more than warmth. She needed time, care, and perhaps a little bit of luck. The human carefully laid her down on the nearest cot, grabbing his emergency medical kit from the nearby shelf. The cold had taken a toll on her, and he had to act quickly. He removed her outer clothing, noticing the strange markings on her skin, markings that seemed too deliberate to be random. Her clothes weren't like anything he had ever seen. She wasn't from any of the colonies or any human settlement, for that matter. His heart raced as he realized she must be an alien, a species he had never encountered before. Her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, but there was still life in her. The human didn't have much time to think. He worked quickly, warming her body with blankets, giving her oxygen, trying to restore the blood flow in her limbs with gentle massage. The whole time he spoke to her in low tones, though he didn't know if she could hear him. "It's going to be okay," he murmured. "You're going to be fine." She stirred slightly at his words, her eyelids fluttering as if she were trying to wake up, but her gaze remained unfocused. She was still lost in the haze of cold, her body fighting against what felt like an insurmountable obstacle. The human knew the risks. He had seen enough cases like this to understand that there was a fine line between saving someone and watching them slip away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the woman's eyes opened fully, though she seemed disoriented. She blinked several times, staring up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Her pupils were dark, almost like a stormy sky, but there was a sharpness to them, a hidden strength that belied her current state. "Where? Where am I?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, hoarse and weak. The human tried to give her a reassuring smile, though he knew it probably looked awkward under the circumstances. "You're safe. You're inside. You were almost frozen to death out there." The woman blinked again, her brow furrowing as if she didn't understand what he was saying. Her eyes shifted around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Slowly, she tried to sit up, but the movement was sluggish, and she winced as if her body was fighting her. "No. I don't belong here," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Her words were broken, fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite fit together. The human frowned, sensing that there was more to her story than she was letting on. But for now, he needed to focus on getting her back on her feet. He didn't want to overwhelm her with questions just yet. "Rest for now," he said gently, his voice low and steady. "You've been through a lot, just breathe, you're safe here." She looked at him again, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if studying him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the shelter's heating system. Then in a barely audible voice, she spoke again, her words heavy with something the human couldn't quite place. "Thank you for saving me." The human nodded, though he wasn't sure what to say. This was uncharted territory, both for him and for her. He had pulled her from the cold, yes, but he also knew that the dangers for both of them were far from over. He could feel the weight of the situation, the unknown forces that were undoubtedly tracking her. He wasn't just keeping her alive. He was becoming part of something far bigger than himself. Still, for now, all he could do was wait and watch, and hope that the warmth of this place would be enough to save her from the cold, both the cold outside and the cold that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The shelter was quiet except for the soft hum of the heating system, which seemed to fill the empty space with a comforting warmth. The woman was still lying on the cot, but now she appeared to be more alert, her eyes tracking his movements as he moved around the room. The human kept his distance, allowing her time to adjust to her surroundings. She was recovering, but her gaze remained distant, as if she were lost in her thoughts. He could sense the turmoil within her, but he didn't press her. She had been through too much already, and he knew it would take time for her to trust him. Her eyes followed him as he sat down at a small table near the far side of the room. The storm outside had only worsened since they had arrived here, the wind howling with a force that made the walls of the shelter shake. It was a stark reminder of how dangerous this planet could be and how lucky they were to have found shelter. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt strange. He was used to being alone, but the presence of another person, especially one so unlike anyone he had ever met, made the quiet feel different. He glanced at her occasionally, watching as she slowly sat up, her eyes scanning the room. She seemed lost in her own thoughts, her expression unreadable. Finally, she broke the silence. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice still weak but steadier than before. There was a hint of suspicion in her tone, as though she were trying to place him, but at the same time she seemed genuinely curious. The human hesitated, unsure of how much to say. He had been living alone for years, and he wasn't used to sharing much about himself. But something about her vulnerability, her strange yet captivating presence, made him want to share more than he usually would. "My name's Kyle," he said after a moment. "I'm just a traveler, really. I come from Earth." "Earth," she repeated the word as if she were tasting it. "I've never heard of it." Kyle smiled faintly. "I wouldn't expect you to. We're a long way from home, even by my standards." She nodded slowly, taking in the information, but clearly not fully understanding. She wasn't from this galaxy, of that, he was certain. The markings on her skin, the strange accent in her voice, and the way she seemed to perceive the world in a way that was different from any human he had ever met all pointed to one undeniable fact. She was not of this world. "I'm sorry I don't know more about you," Kyle said, trying to keep his voice calm. "But I've never seen someone like you before. Are you from another planet?" Her eyes flickered with something like recognition, but she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at her hands, her fingers curling into fists as though she were trying to hold onto something. Kyle didn't press her for an answer. He could tell she was struggling with something, whether it was the trauma of her near-death experience or the shock of being stranded in an unfamiliar place. He couldn't say. "You've been through a lot," Kyle said softly, his voice gentle. "You don't have to talk if you're not ready. I'm not here to force you into anything." She met his gaze then, her eyes sharp and intense. There was something almost regal about the way she carried herself, despite her weakened state. She didn't seem afraid, not exactly, but there was an underlying wariness to her demeanor. I don't know where I am, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I was escaping. They left me, my people. They betrayed me. Kyle's heart tightened at her words. He had seen enough to know when someone was speaking the truth, and there was no doubt in his mind that she was. But the weight of her words was heavier than anything he could have imagined. He couldn't begin to understand what it must have been like to be betrayed by one's own people, especially someone who carried the air of royalty in the way she held herself. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, Kyle said, standing up and walking toward the small stove. He needed to keep moving to keep his mind busy. But if you do, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. She didn't speak for a long time, and Kyle wondered if she would say anything at all. But eventually, her voice broke the silence again. They wanted to use me, she said, her tone flat, as though she had already accepted the truth of it. To control me, to control my people. Kyle frowned. He wasn't sure what she meant, but he could tell that her story was one of pain and loss. He could see the flicker of anger in her eyes, a fire that still burned despite everything she had been through. I was supposed to marry someone, she continued, her voice low. A man they chose for me, he wasn't even someone I knew. They wanted to make an alliance with his people, and I was the key. But I refused. I couldn't be a pawn in their game. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her decision. Kyle could see the quiet strength in her, the refusal to be used even at the cost of her own safety. It reminded him of the kind of person he had once been, a person who had fought for his freedom even when it seemed impossible. That's why they left me, she said, her voice tight with emotion. They didn't need me anymore. They thought I was useless. They left me to die. Kyle felt a surge of anger, but he tamped it down. Anger wouldn't help her now. They were wrong, he said firmly. You're not useless. The woman looked at him, her expression softening slightly. Thank you, she said quietly. But I don't know how much longer I can keep running. They'll come after me. They won't stop until I'm gone. Kyle stood up straight, a sense of determination settling over him. Then we'll keep running together, and we won't stop. She gave him a faint smile, the first one he had seen since their meeting, though it was tinged with sadness. You're not afraid? Kyle shrugged, his eyes steady. I've faced worse than this. I'm not about to let anyone hurt you. For a moment, they both just stood there, silently acknowledging the unspoken bond that had formed between them. He didn't know what it was about her. Maybe it was the strength she carried, or maybe it was something deeper. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't about to leave her alone to face whatever dangers lay ahead. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling like a beast outside the shelter. But in here with her, it was quiet, warm, safe. And for the first time in a long while, Kyle allowed himself to feel something other than the coldness of space. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for both of them. The days following the storm were filled with uncertainty, but for the first time since he had found her, Kyle felt a sense of purpose. The woman, whose name she had finally whispered to him, was slowly recovering, though she still seemed distant, lost in her own thoughts. He had learned that her name was Elira, though there was an undeniable sadness behind her words when she spoke it. It was as if her name was a memory she no longer wanted to carry. The shelter had become their temporary refuge, a place of relative safety on a planet that could not care less about them. Elira's physical condition had improved, and while she wasn't quite strong enough to venture outside, her spirit seemed to grow with each passing day. She spoke less about her past and more about the things she had learned about human life, often asking Kyle questions about Earth, about how people lived, and what it meant to be free. Kyle had a lot to tell her, though he never fully opened up. He told her about Earth, about the endless blue skies and green fields, the cities that stretched for miles, and the quiet beauty of the forests and mountains. But it always felt incomplete, as if his words couldn't truly capture the essence of what it was like to live there. His life had never been simple, but in the way Elira listened, with such intensity and quiet curiosity, he felt for the first time in a long time that there was someone who truly cared. But despite the warmth between them, something lingered between them, an unspoken truth. Elira's eyes, despite their newfound warmth, still carried a weight, as if they were haunted by memories Kyle couldn't even begin to understand. He could tell that she was more than just a victim of circumstance. There was something powerful about her, something he couldn't yet grasp. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Elira looked up from the small table where she had been sitting, her eyes narrowing as if she were sensing something far beyond their immediate surroundings. "They're coming," she said, her voice low and steady, though there was a hint of tension in her tone. Kyle froze, his hand hovering over the small stove where he had been preparing their meal. His mind immediately raced, going through the possibilities. He had heard nothing outside the shelter, but then again the wind was loud enough to mask any sounds. Still, the feeling of dread that filled the air was undeniable. "Who?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though he knew the answer. It had to be them, her people, or more likely, the faction that had betrayed her. They wouldn't stop until they had her. "My people," Elira said quietly, though her eyes were distant, as though she were seeing something far away. "Or rather, those who claim to be my people. They'll stop at nothing to get me back. They believe they have a right to control me." Kyle could see the anger flicker in her eyes, but there was something else, too, something more vulnerable, something he hadn't noticed before. Fear. "I won't let them take you," Kyle said, his voice firm, though his insides churned with uncertainty. "I don't want to go back," Elira whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want to be used again, Kyle. I don't want to be a tool for their power games." Her words struck something deep within him, a memory of his own battles, his own struggles for freedom. He understood what she was feeling, the deep, gnawing desire not to be used, not to be just a pawn in someone else's game. But this wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about something deeper. It was about giving Elira the chance to live her life on her terms, free from the chains of her past. "We'll figure something out," Kyle said, trying to calm her fears. "But first, we need to move. We can't stay here. If they've found this place, they'll know where to look." The thought of leaving the shelter filled Kyle with unease. It had become their only safe haven, the only place that had felt secure since Elira had arrived. But he knew they couldn't stay. If her enemies were closing in, staying put would only make them sitting targets. "We need to get off the planet," Kyle said, his mind already working on the next steps. "I have a small ship nearby, an old scout vessel. It's not much, but it's enough to get us off this rock. We'll head to the nearest station. We'll figure things out from there." Elira nodded, though her expression was still clouded with worry. "Will they follow us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Probably," Kyle said, his jaw tightening. "But we'll be faster and we'll have the advantage of surprise. They're not expecting us to leave so soon. We'll have a head start." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the best they had. They both knew it wouldn't be easy. It never was, but they had no choice. They couldn't stay here, not with her enemies closing in. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. Kyle gathered the necessary supplies, food, medical equipment, anything that could help them survive the journey ahead. Elira, despite her unease, helped him, her hands moving quickly and efficiently, though her eyes rarely left the door. Every sound, every shift in the wind seemed to make her jump. She was still on edge, still haunted by the fear of being hunted. Finally, when everything was packed and ready, they left the shelter behind. The planet was dark now, the stars shining bright in the sky above. It was a beautiful sight, but it felt distant, as if it belonged to another world. Kyle led Elira through the icy landscape, their breaths misting in the cold night air. The ship was just a few kilometers away, nestled in a small valley hidden from the more obvious paths. It wasn't much to look at, an old scout vessel, its hull weathered and scratched from years of disuse. But it was functional, and that was all that mattered. They reached the ship without incident, though Elira kept glancing over her shoulder, as if she expected to see shadows moving in the distance. Kyle didn't blame her. He felt the same way. Inside the ship, Kyle worked quickly, firing up the engines and securing the airlocks. Elira sat in the corner, her face pale as she watched him, her eyes still distant. She had been through so much already, and now, just when it seemed like they might have a chance at escaping, there was the ever-present fear that they would be caught. "Ready?" Kyle asked, his voice low as he turned to face her. Elira nodded, but her expression was still one of uncertainty. "Are you?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Kyle hesitated for a moment before responding. "I'm ready, and I'll get us out of here, I promise." With that, he initiated the final countdown for takeoff. The ship rumbled as the engines came to life, and the cold, desolate world of the planet fell away beneath them. They were in the air now, heading toward the unknown. As they ascended into the dark expanse of space, Elira's hand brushed Kyle's. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. She wasn't just grateful. She was trusting him, and in that moment Kyle knew he couldn't fail her. They were alone, but they were not without hope. Not anymore. The ship hummed steadily as it moved through the vast emptiness of space. Outside, the stars stretched out in every direction, cold and indifferent. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Elira sat in the seat beside Kyle, her eyes scanning the controls and the view screen, her fingers tapping restlessly against her arm. The steady rhythm of the ship's systems was a comfort, but the silence between them felt heavy, almost suffocating. Kyle kept his eyes on the controls, his hands steady on the flight panel. They had left the planet far behind, but they were far from safe. He had no illusions about that. Her enemies would be searching for her, and now they had a head start, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. It would take more than just a few hours to make it to the nearest station, and they needed to stay out of sight until then. Elira seemed lost in her thoughts, her eyes distant as she stared out into the vastness of space. Kyle could sense the weight of everything she had been through, the burdens that she carried on her shoulders. He had never imagined that helping someone would be so complicated, so fraught with danger. But he couldn't back out now. He had made a promise and he intended to keep it. "Are you all right?" Kyle asked, his voice low but steady. Elira didn't look at him right away. Her gaze remained fixed on the stars, her expression unreadable. It was only after a long moment that she finally spoke. "I'm not sure," she said quietly. "I thought I would feel relief, but instead it's just more uncertainty, more fear. I can't outrun my past, Kyle." Her words were simple, but the emotion behind them hit Kyle harder than he expected. She had been through so much, and now, even after escaping the people who had betrayed her, she felt trapped by something she couldn't escape. It wasn't just her enemies chasing her. It was the weight of everything she had lost, everything she had been forced to give up. Kyle didn't know how to respond. He wasn't a counselor and he didn't have the answers, but he understood the feeling. He had run from his own past for years, and now, in some ways, they were running together. The difference was that he had never had something worth fighting for like she did. Elira had been born into something much bigger than herself. She had been part of a world that expected her to sacrifice everything for the sake of power. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," Kyle said, his voice firm but gentle. "You're not alone anymore. We'll figure this out. You'll figure this out." She turned her head then, her eyes meeting his. There was something vulnerable in them, something raw and honest. It was the first time since he had found her that she seemed to let down her guard, even if just for a moment. "I don't know how to trust again," she said softly. "After everything, I don't know if I can ever trust anyone." Kyle understood. Trust was a fragile thing, and when it was broken, it was hard to rebuild. He had learned that the hard way. He didn't press her for answers. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging her pain without trying to fix it. Some wounds couldn't be healed with words. Sometimes they just had to be lived through. The hours passed in silence, the only sound the soft hum of the ship's engines. Kyle kept a steady course, glancing at the readouts occasionally to make sure they were on track. Elira, for the most part, remained quiet. Occasionally, she would ask questions about Earth, about the people there, but it was clear she wasn't fully engaged. Her mind was somewhere else, tangled in the web of her past. As they neared the nearest station, Kyle began to feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. They had made good progress, but the station would be a risky place to stop. It was a hub for travelers, mercenaries, and traders, people who didn't always ask the right questions. Elira's face was too distinctive, too memorable. If her enemies had the resources to track her down, they would certainly be looking for her there. "We need to be careful when we land," Kyle said, his voice low as he glanced over at Elira. "The station isn't exactly the safest place for people like us. If they're looking for you, they might have eyes everywhere." Elira nodded without saying anything. She wasn't surprised. The harsh reality of being hunted had become her new normal. The idea of safety, of peace, felt like a distant dream, but she didn't argue. She had learned long ago that sometimes survival meant making difficult choices, choices that didn't always feel right. As the station came into view, the vast metal structure looming against the darkness of space, Kyle began to prepare for their approach. The station was a lifeline, but it was also a danger. He would have to be cautious, slip in unnoticed, and hope that they could get what they needed without attracting attention. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best option. He eased the ship toward the station's docking bay, his hands steady as he guided the vessel into the familiar patterns. The air was tense, but Kyle kept his focus, knowing that any mistake could be the one that cost them everything. "Ready?" he asked, glancing at Elira. She didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the station outside the viewport. There was something unreadable in her eyes, a mix of fear and determination that Kyle couldn't quite place. "Ready," she said at last, her voice steady but distant. Kyle couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. What it must be like to have your entire life turned upside down, to be hunted by your own people, to be cast aside like an object, as if your value was only tied to what you could give to others. He didn't know how to fix that, but he knew that he wasn't going to let her face it alone. The ship docked with a soft thud, the quiet hum of the station's systems reaching them as they powered down. Kyle exhaled slowly, his fingers still gripping the controls. This was it. They had made it this far, but now they would have to be careful. "We'll need to blend in," Kyle said, turning to Elira. "Don't draw attention, stay close and follow my lead." Elira nodded, but her eyes were distant once more. She wasn't just concerned about survival, Kyle could see it now. She was trying to find herself again in a world that had torn her apart, but he didn't have the answers. He could protect her from the dangers that lurked in the shadows, but the emotional scars, those were something only she could heal. As they exited the ship, the sound of the station's artificial gravity systems kicked in, and they found themselves in the hustle and bustle of the docking bay. It was a busy place, full of people coming and going, merchants unloading goods, travelers moving between ships, and a few unsavory characters lingering in the corners. The atmosphere was tense, but it was normal. Just another day at the station. Kyle moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. Elira stayed close behind him, her steps hesitant but steady. She was trying to blend in, but Kyle could tell that her eyes were constantly darting around, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. They moved through the crowd, blending in with the flow of people as they headed toward the marketplace. Kyle knew they needed supplies, food, water, medical equipment, but he also needed information. He needed to know how much time they had before her enemies caught up with them. As they rounded a corner, a voice called out from behind them. Kyle's body tensed instinctively, his hand moving toward the small weapon at his side. Elira stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes widening as she looked around. But the voice wasn't one of her enemies. It was just another traveler, another person in this vast, cold place. "Hey, you two, you've got to see this," the man called, waving them over. Kyle hesitated, his instincts telling him to keep moving. But Elira, curious despite herself, nudged him gently. "Maybe we can get some information," she said, her voice quiet but hopeful. Reluctantly, Kyle nodded, and they approached the man. Whatever this station had in store for them, they couldn't afford to ignore any chance of finding allies. At least, that was what he told himself. And as they walked forward, the unease in his stomach only grew. The man who had called them over was standing in the middle of a small market stall, surrounded by crates of strange goods. His clothes were worn and his face was shadowed by the low light of the station, but his eyes were sharp and his smile wide. He didn't seem like a threat, but Kyle remained cautious. Elira, on the other hand, seemed intrigued, her gaze moving from the man to the various items stacked around him. "You two look like you could use a little help," the man said, his voice gravelly but friendly. "I've got everything you might need, food, water, anything. I also hear things, you know. Not many people pass through this station without making a few enemies." Kyle narrowed his eyes, instinctively protective of Elira, but the man didn't seem dangerous. He was just another face in the crowd, a person trying to make a living in a place that had no mercy for those who didn't watch their backs. "We're fine," Kyle said curtly, but the man's smile didn't falter. Instead, his eyes flickered to Elira. "You sure about that?" "You don't look fine, you look like you're running," the man said, his tone dropping to something more serious. "And I'd bet my last credit that someone's chasing you or you wouldn't be here." Elira stiffened beside Kyle, but she didn't speak. She wasn't ready to trust anyone just yet. "We don't need trouble," Kyle replied, his voice low and warning. He didn't like where this was going, but the man didn't seem to be getting the hint. "Ah, but you're already in it, whether you like it or not," the man said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Look, all I'm saying is that I've got information. I'm not asking for much, just a little bit of your time." Kyle glanced at Elira, whose expression was unreadable, but her eyes were alert, scanning the surroundings. She was on edge, the tension in the air thickening with every passing second. He couldn't afford to ignore anything that might give them an advantage. "All right," Kyle said reluctantly. "What do you know?" The man's smile grew. He leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. I know you're not the only ones looking for that ship. There's a bounty on your head, lady. He nodded toward Elira, who stiffened. And your enemies aren't too far behind. Elira's hand clenched into a fist, but Kyle's grip on her arm was firm, keeping her from reacting. The last thing they needed was a scene here. How much? Kyle asked, his voice low but dangerous. The man didn't flinch. Enough to make people take a real interest in you. And by people, I mean some pretty ruthless folks who won't hesitate to make you disappear. Elira took a step forward, her eyes flashing with anger, but Kyle held her back. She was still weak, and getting into a fight here was a risk neither of them could afford. So, what's your angle? Kyle asked. You're trying to help or just trying to sell us out? The man chuckled, shaking his head. Help, not exactly. But I can point you in the right direction. I know where you can hide, where they won't find you, at least not easily. Kyle's mind raced. Hiding wasn't an ideal solution, but if it bought them more time, it could be exactly what they needed. We're listening, Kyle said, his tone guarded but open. He needed to know what the man had to offer, even if he didn't trust him completely. The man nodded, glancing over his shoulder as if making sure no one was watching them too closely. There's a safe house, a place that doesn't get much attention. The owner's a former merc, one who knows how to keep a low profile. It's not far from here, but you'll need to move fast. Kyle exchanged a look with Elira. The idea of staying in one place for too long felt dangerous, but moving on without any safe haven to rest was equally as risky. How much? Kyle asked again, his hand still resting lightly on Elira's shoulder. She was tense, her body rigid, but she didn't move away. She knew they had no other options. The man scratched his chin thoughtfully. Well, I'm not gonna say it's free, but you can pay me when you're ready. I'm not one for upfront fees. Just get to the safe house, stay there for a while, and I'll come back when things cool off. Kyle didn't like the idea of owing this man anything, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. If they stayed at the station, the chances of being caught were high, but a place to lay low for a bit. That could give them the time they needed to plan their next move. All right, Kyle said, his voice firm, lead the way. The man smiled again, clearly pleased with the deal. He gestured for them to follow him, leading them down a narrow corridor of the station, past darkened corners and dimly lit walkways. The atmosphere felt different here, less crowded but more dangerous. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with tension. Kyle kept his hand near the small weapon at his side, alert for any sign of trouble. Elira walked close behind him, her eyes constantly shifting, scanning every face they passed, every shadow. She was on edge, and Kyle couldn't blame her. They didn't know who to trust, not anymore. Not even this man. They reached a small door near the end of the hall, and the man pulled out a key card, swiping it across the panel. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a small, dimly lit room on the other side. This is it, the man said, stepping aside to let them enter. The owner's a friend of mine, so you'll be safe here for a while. I'll check back in a few days, make sure you're still in one piece. He winked, though it wasn't a comforting gesture. Kyle looked at Elira, who nodded slightly, though her face was still unreadable. He didn't like the idea of staying in a place where they were expected to hide, but there was no better choice for now. They couldn't keep running forever, and they needed time to regroup. Thanks, Kyle said, his tone clipped. We'll be waiting. The man shrugged and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hall. Kyle waited until he was out of sight before turning to Elira. She was already moving toward a small cot in the corner, her movements slow but deliberate. We'll rest here for the night, Kyle said quietly. In the morning, we'll figure out what's next. Elira didn't respond immediately, but her eyes met his, and for the first time in a long while, there was something soft in her gaze. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let Kyle know that she wasn't giving up. They hadn't come this far to fall apart now. We've got time, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Kyle didn't answer, but he nodded. They did have time, at least for now, and as long as they stuck together, they had a chance. It was a small chance, but it was more than either of them had when they had first met. He moved to the other side of the room, sitting on a crate near the door. His eyes stayed on Elira, but his mind was already working, already thinking of their next move. The man had given them a place to stay, but that didn't mean they were safe. Not yet. Not until they were far away from the people who wanted Elira dead. For now, though, they had to rest. And maybe, just maybe, in the quiet of this strange place, they could find a moment of peace.